Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope you're all well and weathering the chill that's beginning in the fall. Uh, we are here to study a little bit of the Kuzari today, and then we're going to go learn something for Parshas Vayera that I wanted to share with you. We're on page 373 in the Kuzari, and we are in the middle of studying Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's disputation with the Karaites. And at the very end of that conversation, as we get close to finishing the third essay, he is demonstrating the very, very impressive line of tradition of our sages in order to demonstrate the veracity and the integrity of the oral tradition. So we've been learning about sages who were living during the Second Temple period. We talked about the rabbis who lived through the destruction of the Second Temple. And before we get to the rabbis who are now going to live in the post-Churban era, after the destruction of the Second Temple and starting in the first century of the Common Era, the late first century of the Common Era, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi just takes a short interlude in this discussion to talk about the body of sages known as the Sanhedrin. And it would seem to me that the reason why he's creating this interlude, as will be apparent, is because, as we all know, that with the disbanding of the temple, with the Churban of the temple, there was also eventually the disbanding of the Sanhedrin. So he wants to leave us with a lasting impression of what this body of sages was all about. Page 373, we are on the bottom three lines of the text. This is the third essay, still paragraph 65, subparagraph 10. In addition to these famous individuals that he's just enumerated, in the previous paragraph, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his various disciples, the multitude of sages and the Kohanim and the Leviim, whose occupation was Torah study, these generations had a continuously operative Sanhedrin of 70 sages. So what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wants to impress us with is that during the Second Temple period, there was a great amount of Torah study by a huge percentage of the Jewish community. This does not mean that everyone living in the Second Temple era was literate. As a matter of fact, we know historically that most Jews, just like most of the civilized world, was illiterate in the ancient world. But each society, each culture had a different emphasis on education, on literacy. The Jewish emphasis on literacy was only re-emphasized and redoubled in the period of the sages, especially because they recognized that there was a cessation of prophecy and that the only way that we were going to continue a tradition of practice in our faith was through education. This became of paramount importance. And therefore, there were famous individuals, the multitude of sages, Kohanim and Leviim, whose parnasa was supported by the Jewish community during the Second Temple period, devoted whatever time that they weren't working in the temple to Torah study. And as a result, there were huge enclaves of Talmidei Chachamim during the Second Temple period. But in addition to that, these generations had a continuously operative Sanhedrin of 70 sages. Now, we rule in the Mishnah that there were actually 71 sages. And the reason why there needed to be 71 is because, according to the sages, there needed to be an odd number in order to be able to break a tie. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is rounding it to 70, but it's really 71. It was through the Sanhedrin that they appointed their leaders and adjusted their calendars. The Sanhedrin would have to be consulted anytime any political leader of the Jewish people was going to be assigned. Furthermore, the Sanhedrin was in charge of establishing the new month, Rosh Chodesh. When it was, they cross-examined witnesses who came to testify personally about sightings of the new moon. And so there was a tremendous amount of authority that was vested within the Sanhedrin throughout the Second Temple period. Thus do we find that Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, who's known just plainly as Ben Azai, he said, I have a tradition that was pronounced by the 72 elders on the day they appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah as head of the academy. Now, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah lives a little bit after the destruction of the Second Temple. He's a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, and also what's unusual is that he says 72 elders instead of 70 or 71. The commentaries point out that in addition to the 71 judges, there was a presidium or someone who would preside or the chairman of the Sanhedrin, and he did not have a vote on the Sanhedrin, but he was sort of like the Speaker of the House, or what do you call it in Canadian Parliament, the guy who sits on the throne and has the staff or the gavel, whatever they call that. I'm sorry for being so ignorant in parliamentary tradition, but it's basically there was a fellow who would known as the sort of the speaker or
He's
someone.
He's the Speaker of the House here.
Is that called the Speaker of the House? Yeah.
The Parliament, of the House of Commons.
Yeah, of the House of Commons. So if I'm not mistaken, he doesn't have a vote. He just is there to make sure that everyone's behaving themselves and comporting themselves with proper decorum. Is that right? I mean, that's at least what I've witnessed.
I think he can act as a tiebreaker if there is a tie ever.
All right. But this 72nd judge of the Sanhedrin actually did not have a vote, according to the commentaries. The point being is that the reason for this quote is that there is a tradition that the Sanhedrin had passed down to later generations of sages. The Sanhedrin, it's not clear exactly when they disbanded. We do know that as the temple was being besieged by the Romans, the Sanhedrin exiled itself to Yavne and to Usha and to other places, other cities, in order to preserve the integrity of the Sanhedrin at a time when Jerusalem was under great siege and distress. But eventually, sometime in the first century, it seems that the Sanhedrin just disbanded completely. And that's really also marked to one degree or another, also the period of within a period of a few decades, that also marked the end of the period of the Tanoim, of the Mishnaic sages. Smicha, as it was known, was only granted by members of the Sanhedrin. So smicha, which is ordination to be able to be a member of the Sanhedrin, was granted only to a select number of sages. What we call smicha today is really a borrowed term. It's not the real smicha that existed back then. Okay, and his final point really just is to underscore a very important issue, which is the huge numbers of rabbinic scholars that existed during the Second Temple period and shortly thereafter. There were hundreds of sages, lower in rank, waiting to be selected for these 70 places or 71 places. And there were in turn thousands who were waiting behind these hundreds. There were, the Mishnah discusses that in every convening of the Sanhedrin, there were 3 rows of additional sort of understudies who were ready to either act as tiebreakers, because if there was ever, even though there's an odd number on the Sanhedrin, there's 71 judges, or in a lower Sanhedrin, there would be 23 judges, also an odd number. But if you want to convict an accused criminal, you can't just have a majority of 1. You need a majority of at least 2. So if, let's say, there was a Sanhedrin of 23, and the vote was 12 to 11 to convict, that would not be sufficient to convict. You could not exonerate a person, but you also could not convict him. So they would need to add an additional 2 judges to act as tiebreakers. And they would, because you always needed an odd number on the Sanhedrin, they would add an additional 2 judges. So there were always understudy judges waiting in the wings. And as the Mishnah in Sanhedrin describes, there were 3 rows of 23 of these understudy judges. And also, whenever a member of the Sanhedrin passed away or became incapacitated, they would take the first man in the first row and give him smicha and put him as an immediate replacement to the person who had passed or was incapacitated. So there were always understudy judges, and there were understudies of the understudies. And so this really leads us to conclude that there was a community of thousands of rabbinic scholars alive during this time. All right, so Shmuel tells us that the Speaker of the House of Commons is the presiding officer of the lower house of the Parliament of Canada. The Speaker's role in presiding over Canada's House of Commons is similar to that of speakers elsewhere in other countries. The Speaker remains a sitting MP, but only votes on matters in the case of the tie. Okay, thank you for that. Okay. This is because it is only possible, continues the Kuzari, to select 70 supreme sages from a select group of hundreds that are just below their rank. And the same goes for selecting the hundreds. For the hundreds of understudies, there had to be even more understudies of the understudies so that we could limit the pool of candidates and limit it down to the best, the cream of the crop. So there were many, many qualified rabbis of this time, or the term rabbis is an anachronism. They were not really rabbis, they were just scholars, and they would become rabbis. They would get their smicha if they were appointed to the Sanhedrin, but they were great sages nonetheless with great Torah knowledge, and there was a huge pool of them from which to select the elite group of the 71 judges of the Sanhedrin. And the point that he's trying to make is, don't think that for the most part during the Second Temple period that there was this very, very small pool of conspirators who could alter the tradition. There were huge numbers of scholars throughout the Second Temple period, so that even though, yes, it's true, it was an elite class within Judaism because the majority of Jews were illiterate, but they still were a significant number of people. And the more people that you have perpetuating a tradition, the more veracity or authenticity it is assumed to have. Because it wasn't just made up by like a small group of, like they talk about the smoke-filled room of, a back room where people, a cabal conspires to come up with a new policy that no one else knows about. No, it wasn't at all like that. And that's really what Rabbi Yehuda Levi is trying to dispel, that myth of a cabal, a small cabal of sages who sort of rewrote all of rabbinic law and just pulled it out of thin air. That's not at all the case. There were hundreds of thousands of sages in every generation of the Second Temple period, and they faithfully transmitted this to the next generation and the next generation after that. So that's really his point. And now with the advent of the late first century, which is, he's going through a historical review of what's going on, and then the next paragraph is going to discuss the sages who lived after the destruction of the temple. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yossi Haglili, the people who we read about on the night of the Seder, who are going to be reclining in the city of Bnei Brak and discussing the Seder. So that's going to be our topic of discussion in Yirtzeh Hashem next week, when we continue with the following paragraph 11 on page 374. Any questions or comments at this point? Okay, wonderful. If not, I'm going to we're going to do a short Kuzari section today, because I want to go to the Parsha and I want us to discuss an important idea. that I'd like to present to you from the Psukim. So allow me to bring up my screen and share it with you. Okay, the topic of our Devar Torah today is Philistines and co-opting religion. You know, when you call someone a Philistine, this is actually, I think goes back to at least the 18th century. The term Philistine was used to describe not only a person who came from ancient Philistia, but there was once a preacher, I think sometime in the 17th or 18th century, who was critical of the people of a certain village, and he called them Philistines. And there it became a term. Now, how did he get this term? Well, he got it from the fact that when you look at the way that the Philistines are portrayed in scripture, both really on our parsha, next week's parsha, and also really in the book of Shmuel, and other books of the early prophets, you note that the Philistines were a warmongering people that really didn't have their own inherent culture and an appreciation for the finer things in life. They were considered to be brutes. They had migrated somewhere from the area of what is now Turkey or Greece, made their way down the Mediterranean coast, settled in the western part of Eretz Yisrael, and really didn't have their own intellectual treasury of their own in their own society, and so and that's why they're looked down upon. They're sort of looked down upon as being unenlightened and counter-intellectual and brutish and given to violence. And that's the way the Philistines are portrayed in the book of Shoftim with Shimshon and the book of Sefer Shmuel and in so many other places throughout Tanakh. And that's why in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, a Philistine, that is when it's not capitalized, is a person who is guided by materialism and is usually disdainful of intellectual or artistic values, or one uninformed in a special area of knowledge. You would call them a Philistine. Okay, so that's how it's used in the contemporary terms. But if we were going to associate that to the term Plishti, as they appear in our Parsha, Parshas Vayera, we know that Avraham lived in Gerar and he lived in Philistine territory. And we know that he ran afoul of King Avimelech, both because of his wife Sarah, which is discussed in this week's Parsha, because Avimelech, just like Pharaoh of last week's Parsha, took a liking to Sarah's beauty, and he was also afflicted in his household. And at some point, Avimelech and his chief officer, Fichol, realize that Avraham is a holy man, that miracles happen because of him, and they wish to avoid provoking Avraham because they recognize that a very, very powerful deity is on Abraham's side. So you get in Perek Chaf Aleph in chapter 21 of our Parsha, Vayi ba'itahi, during this time when Avraham is creating a name for himself, Vayomer Avimelech ufichol sar tzavel Avraham lemor. And Avimelech says to Avraham together with Fichol, he says, Elokim imecha b'chol asher ata oseh. It's clear that God is with you in everything that you are doing. Ve'ata. And so, therefore, or some translate it as now, or behold, Hishava li ve'elokim hein. I want us to make an oath. I want you to swear to me in the name of your God, im tishkor li ulenini ulenechti, that you will not deceive me or my future descendants in any way. Kachesed asher asiti imecha ta'aseh imadi, and that therefore I ask you to pledge to me that just as I have shown you kindness and have allowed you to live in my land, in the Philistine land, I want you to do the same kindness to me as well, and to the land in which you live. So Vayomer Avraham Anochi Yishaveya. And Avraham said, that sounds quite reasonable. I am willing to make that pledge, that oath to you. that I will be faithful to you and I will do kindness to you and to your land. But then the Torah tells us that v'hochiach Avraham et Avimelech al odot be'er hamayim asher gazelu avdei Avimelech. That Avraham rebuked Avimelech over the wells of water that the servants of Avimelech had stolen from him. And Avimelech, and as the story goes, we read this, by the way, on Rosh Hashanah. Avimelech says to Avraham, I didn't even know about this. He doesn't really even make restitution to Avraham. He just says, I had no idea that this was going on. And Avraham seemingly just is willing to overlook this whole fact that he's been harassed and has had his hard, the hard work that he's worked on to dig wells taken away from him. But in the end, Avraham gives Avimelech 7 sheep and enters into a covenant with him, enters into a pact with him that they are going to be, they will have it's basically a peace accord, and that there is peace between Avraham and his empire and the Philistines whose land he is living among. Okay? Now, what's curious is that this pact did not seem to be upheld by the Philistines. They were really acting like Philistines, right, in the ultimate analysis, because when you look at next week's Parsha, it says, V'chol ha'be'erot asher chaferu avdei aviv b'mei Avraham aviv, that all the wells that the servants of Yitzchak's father, this is now next week's Parsha dealing with the life of Yitzchak, in 2 weeks' time, Parshas told us it's in 2 weeks' time. We have next week is Chaye Sar, and then in 2 weeks' time we'll read Parshas Toldos. It says all the wells that Avraham's servants, Yitzchak's father's servants, had dug, Bimei Avraham Aviv, Sitimun Plishtim Vayimal Umafar. The Philistines had filled up those wells, filled them with earth, filled them with dirt. And so, so in our Parsha, the Philistines are stealing the wells. And in Yitzchak's times, instead of stealing the wells, they're just destroying the wells. And this too becomes a point of contention. And Yitzchak has to struggle with the Philistines, and he goes to another place and digs a well, and they fill up his well. And he goes to another place and he digs a well, and they fill up that well. And finally, he goes to a third place and he digs a well, and they leave him alone. And he calls that place Rechovot, because God has given me respite, which is really what Rechovot implies. So you see that there's something strange going on. In Avraham's time, they are taking the wells. They're not destroying the wells because they realize that there's value to these wells, but they just confiscate the wells from Avraham and kick his servants off the land. In Yitzchak's times, instead of confiscating the wells, perhaps they felt that they didn't have power to do that. Yitzchak had already been well established as being the heir of Avraham. And so instead of just confiscating the wells, they have another method of foiling this Jew, this successful Jew, and they fill up the wells with dirt instead. And perhaps that was their way of circumventing the pact that Avimelech had made with Avraham. That Avimelech promised to Avraham, I won't confiscate your property anymore. So how do you get around that? Well, if you're a Philistine, you say, okay, we're not allowed to confiscate the Jew's property, so we'll just destroy it, or we'll vandalize it and fill it up with dirt instead. The question, of course, is, what is the larger message that is going on over here? Like, what is the significance from a timeless Torah educational message to all future generations of Jews? What are we supposed to draw from this? And why does the Torah feel that this portion of the narrative of the life of Avram and Yitzchak is relevant to each and every one of us? Because obviously any story, any narration of the life of Avram, Yitzchak, or Yaakov that is included in the Chumash is deemed to be relevant for future generations. Torah leaves out most of the life of Abraham and most of the life of Yitzchak. It only puts in those parts which Hashem feels we need to know in order to know what it means to be a Jew. And so, what relevance are these passages about the wells? Well, I'm going to reference a commentary of Rabbeinu Bechaya, not on our parsha, but on Parshas Toldos. And Rabbeinu Bechaya says something really important. He says, "V'yesh pirshu," and here it is in source number 3. Ki habe'erot halalu remez legerim shenit gayeru bimei Avraham. That these wells are an allusion to all of the people whom Avraham had succeeded in converting and bringing over to ethical monotheism. It really would be anachronistic to call them converts to Judaism, because Judaism as a religion did not really exist yet. But at least he converted them to serving the God of the Jews, right? He converted them to ethical and moral behavior and to this idea of what we call ethical monotheism, right? And so, there's a famous question, what happened to all of them, right? What happened to all of these people? Where did they go? Because, the only record of Jews that we have are Yaakov's 12 sons, and from them is the whole Jewish people. So, but there were other people as well that were deeply influenced by Avraham, and presumably by his children and grandchildren as well. So the story of the wells is a metaphorical allusion to all of the people that Avraham had converted. Kihem kalim lekabbalat emunah, kemo habeirot shehem kalim lekabbalat hamayim. He says, why compare a person who's initiated into the faith of God? Why compare that person to a well? So Rabbeinu Bechaya says that when you dig a well, it's such an easy thing for the well to fill up with water. All you need is for it to rain, and effortlessly the well fills up with water. And so too, people who hear the word of God, you just have to say a few words to them about what it means to be a godly individual. And that person immediately fills up with that sense of spiritual richness, because it's very easy to ignite a soul, is essentially what Rabbeinu Bechaya is suggesting. It's very easy to fill up a soul with the water of Torah. Upetichat halev hasatum be'emunah yechaneha katuv chafira. And therefore, when the Torah wants to metaphorically allude to opening someone's sealed heart and infuse them with faith, it describes it as digging a well. Ulakach yomar mitzad hakinah sitemum plishtim. And that's why in Parshas Toldos, where it talks about the Philistines filling up those wells, what it really is referring to, kolomar sitmu et libam vehechazirum lesuram. What it means is that it's not that Yitzchak did anything wrong in turning away Avraham's converts, which is the way some people view what happened. Like when you ask the question, what happened to all of Avraham's converts? Some people opine that Yitzchak, because he had a very different personality from his father, he wasn't as outgoing, he wasn't as welcoming perhaps as his father Avraham. So the people that Avraham had converted sort of dispersed after Avraham passed away. But Rabbeinu Bechaya says that's not what it means. It means that, but rather, Yitzchak also was very involved in gaining converts and gaining adherents to ethical monotheism. But it was the adverse influence of the Philistines who filled up the wells that that Avraham had dug, and also that Yitzchak was digging. And they were the ones who tried to basically dissuade people from adhering to the faith. V'zehu vayimalu'um afar. And that's what it means, that they filled up these wells with earth. Kitachat shemal'am Avraham chochma vadat et Hashem be'emunat hayichud. And so what essentially is being communicated here is that Avraham had filled these individuals who became converts, he filled them with wisdom and the knowledge of God. But milu'um plishtim emunatam hara'ah. The Philistines instead dissuaded those people and deterred them from faith, and they filled them with false ideas of religious deconstruction, right, and trying to tell them that there is no God, or don't believe in the God of the Jews, and they were cynics, and they filled them with all of these cynical ideas of what we call postmodernism, right? Because we know that in other places, Scripture compares evil or bad counsel to dirt. Bizehu sha'amru afra lepume. That's why the Gemara will sometimes say that if a person says something untoward, if a person says something that's either theologically or halachically problematic, the Gemara will say afra lepume, may dirt fill his mouth. In other words, silence that individual. And that's what the Philistines essentially did, is that they used different kinds of arguments to try and pull people away from the Abrahamic faith. But eventually, after much struggle, Yitzchak was able to finally prevail, at least to a group of his own adherents. And Husha Katuv, Vayoshav Yitzchak Vayachporet Beirot Hamayim Asher Chafru Bimei Avraham Aviv, Vayisatamum Plishtim Acharei Mot Avraham, Vayikra Lahen Shemot Kashemot V'Gomer. He says that that's what it means when it says that Yitzchak redug the wells that the Philistines had filled with earth. He would basically, tried his best to counteract the harmful effects of what the Philistines were doing. Kichein derech hamit gayerim, uche'inyan shekatuv v'la'avadav yikra shem acher. And basically, that's the way of people who convert, is that they change their names. And basically, Yitzchak, what it means that he renamed the wells with the same names that his father had called them, is that when he got his group of adherents, he used the same method of renaming his new converts with names that were Hebraic and were symbolic of their newfound faith, right? And that's what happens when a person converts, is that they choose a new name for themselves that is in some way linked to Torah in some way. So that's what it means when it says that Yitzchak renamed the wells. Now, of course, as the story goes on in Parshas Toldos, not only did Yitzchak redig the wells that his father dug originally, but he also dug his own wells, as I mentioned previously. And this could be an allusion to the fact that even though Yitzchak had gone back to the original adherents of his father, but he also realized that he needed to create his own mission, or his own, what's the word I'm looking for? He had to create a new congregation and his own method of acquiring new adherents. And so while it's true that he redug the wells of his father, but he also innovated of his own, and not only brought back the adherents of his father after the Philistines had turned them away, but he also went out and dug his own wells, started to create other adherents to the Abrahamic faith of ethical monotheism. So that's the way Rabbeinu Bechaya understands what's going on when we talk about filling a well with earth and then unearthing it again. Okay, the question then becomes, well, then what is the metaphor of stealing a well? Okay, so when you confiscate a well, you haven't filled it with earth. So it would seem to me that if Rabbeinu Bechaya's commentary is an acceptable one, and I think it's a very appropriate way of understanding why the Torah deems it necessary to spend so much space on this conflict between the Philistines and Avraham and Yitzchak over wells, because really the wells are a metaphor for the people who are impressed by the lives of Avraham and Yitzchak, these first Jews. So therefore, if the metaphor of filling the well is the Philistine effort to dissuade people from the Abrahamic faith, well, then what does it mean when you confiscate a well? And that's really what I want to get to today. In other words, to sort of build upon Rabbeinu Bechaya and distinguish the difference between confiscating a well and leaving it as a dug well that still provides water versus filling up a well with earth. Okay, and so I wanted to share with you just a piece that I hope will act as a springboard for what we want to try and communicate today. It's a more contemporary commentary from the Sefer Vayechi Yosef. It was written by Rav Yosef Greenwald of blessed memory, who passed away in the early 80s. He was known as the Admor of Pupa. He was originally a Belzer Chassid during World War II and lost his entire family. He lost his wife and 10 children were murdered by the Nazis. He survived, basically picked up the pieces of his life, remarried, had a few more children, and founded the Pupa Hasidic dynasty, which is still in Brooklyn to this day. And you can only marvel at people like that. And we've talked about other people before who were like this. One of the Ger Rebbes was also like this. And so many other great rabbinic personages who. The Kloisenberger Rebbe is another example. People who lost everything during the war and basically decided that instead of reacting with despair, they allowed themselves to be dedicated to the community and basically said, I have to help be part of the solution and to rebuild. Okay, so therefore, V'hochiach Avraham et Avimelech alodot be'er hamayim asher gazlu avdei Avimelech. The Torah says over here that Avraham rebuked Avimelech over the well that the servants of Avimelech had confiscated, had stolen from him. Now, what is that an allusion to? So Rav Greenwald says, Yesh l'rames, the hatachlis shechafar Avraham Avinu et habe'er haya kedei lahafitz bazeh emunat Hashem ba'olam. This is a very similar idea to what Rabbeinu Bechaya had said, that the digging of the well represents the desire that Avram has to share the faith of God with the world. That's the idea of digging a well. Ki chafar et be'er hamayim begodel kedushato. That Avraham digs this well with great holiness. V'chol mi she'over derech habe'er v'ro'eh o shotem mayim min habe'er hahu. And anyone that would pass by the well and would drink the sweet waters of Abraham's well, yehe ole al libo mi chafar habe'er hazot, would be inspired by the digger of the well. And perhaps Avraham would come out and greet them and say, hello, fellow traveler, please have some of my sweet water. It's yours for the taking. And while the fellow is drinking and feeding his camels, Abraham turns to the man and says, have you ever thought about God? Have you ever thought about who's responsible for everything that's in the world? And he would engage the person in a conversation, and through his example of doing chesed, he would impress the person to join the Abrahamic faith and change his life. And this was Avraham's effort through his wells. Ba'al yedei zeh yizkor avodato v'tzidkato u'ma'asim tovim shel Avraham Avinu. And through this well, a traveler would be deeply impressed by all of Avraham's righteousness and all of his kindness. The avoli de emuna shalema, and this is how he would become an adherent to Avraham's faith. Omnam, however, avdei Avimelech, shehem shluchei sam v'hayetzer hara, the servants of Avimelech had a great resentment for this, and they did not want people to turn over to the side of godliness and kindness. Lo hayanichaluhu bekach v'ratzu levatel koach zu. They didn't want this to be the case. They wanted to nullify Abraham's effectiveness and his success. Shelo yavou mehabe'er lidei amunah ba'Hashem. They did not want people to come to a faith of God through the well. Al kain gazlu me Avram habe'er mayim, and therefore they stole from Avraham the well. They confiscated it from him. כדי שמכאן ואילך לא יהי נקרא על שמו, אלא על שם היצר הרע. So that it would no longer be called Abraham's well. People would no longer be inspired when they passed by to think about lofty and holy things when they would meet Avraham, but rather, or meet Avraham's servants, but rather they would be encountered by perhaps other people, Philistines. And the Philistines in turn would not imbue the well with any kind of special holiness. The Yishtakach she'Avraham chafar be'er hazeh. And it would be forgotten that Avraham was the original digger of this well. People would no longer be impressed by Abraham or by his faith. And that was their objective. Their objective was to confound Avraham's efforts. So I just want to use Rav Greenwald's comments as a springboard and an adjunct to what Rabbeinu Bechaya had said, and just try to distinguish for just a moment the difference between filling a well with earth versus confiscating it and co-opting it for your own use. You see, originally, there was no interest in destroying Avraham's well, but rather using it to divert the message that people could have gotten and using it for a different message. So for me, the difference between confiscating a well and filling it with earth is that you still, in the first case, you still want people to drink from the well, but you want them to get a completely different message from the original message that was intended to be conveyed by those who would benefit from the well. And what I view that is basically the co-opting of a religious message. So that, originally you could have a beautiful message of religious values, and then a person could take those original, very beautiful monotheistic message of kindness and ethics, and then co-opt it and basically use it for something completely different. You could attract people through the same acts of kindness, but draw them in to do something which might be considered insidious after a time. You could lure people in through an act of kindness, and then use it to divert them to do something which is considered ultimately evil. And that might have been the first strategy of the Philistines. Why confiscate Avraham's well? If Avraham is so successful at attracting adherents by showing them kindness, let's take the well for ourselves. Let's share the water with them. It doesn't cost us anything. But instead of using the well as a means of attracting them to the Abrahamic faith, let's attract them to the Philistine way of life and say, here, the water is yours for taking. Now join us at the tavern like good Philistines, and join our army and take up arms together with us and do whatever you want. And this is the way that religion has been co-opted for centuries. You can sometimes have a very beautiful religious theme or very beautiful religious message, and then someone comes along and decides that I'm going to use that religious message to either promote a political endeavor or a political party that I feel is aligned with this religious group, or to co-opt religion and to use it to gain power for yourself, to create a power base, or to co-opt a religious message in order to fight your enemies when you need more allies. There are so many ways that religion has been co-opted throughout the centuries, and I believe to a certain extent that religion to this very day is still being co-opted in a number of ways, both outside of Judaism. Many people who profess to be faithful Christians or faithful Muslims will sometimes co-opt religion to promote a message of either violence or anti-Semitism or something having to do with some ulterior motive that they wish to promote, like the preacher who will gather adherents in order to fill his own pockets, right? But it can also exist within Judaism as well, unfortunately. You can co-opt the very symbols that represent the beauty of Judaism, and you can distort them for your own objectives. And the problem that becomes, that results from that, and I'm not going to get into too many specifics for our purposes today, but the problem that ensues when you co-opt religious symbols and religious ideals and religious services, and you use them for ulterior motives, is that ultimately you will not end up with the same group of adherents. Eventually, the next generation, instead of using those religious services and the wells of Avraham, they will eventually fill up those wells with dirt. In other words, what the Torah, I believe, is describing is a progression. If the Philistines start off stealing the wells, and then they realize that that for whatever reason it's either not working or they feel maybe it is working, but you can rest assured that by the next generation, the wells will be filled with earth. Anytime an effort was made to either dilute Judaism, like the Karaites or the Sadducees or other movements within Judaism at later junctures in Jewish history, anytime an effort was made to dilute traditional Judaism, it was met with the next generation turning its back on the diluted form of Judaism. So it's very important. You can try to, you may want to co-opt the well and take the most beautiful aspects of your father's faith and use it for some other purpose. But eventually, if you do that, the well will be filled up with earth. And that will result in no one benefiting from any kind of religious service. So the first stage is to take the religious messages and the beauty of the faith, share it with others for a reason that was completely unintended originally. And then eventually what happens is that the well gets filled up completely, and religion ultimately starts to become corroded and destroyed and corrupted completely. Okay. All right, so that's really the point that I wanted to share with you today. I hope that you can draw some applications to it. The important thing is, don't be a Philistine. Don't be a Philistine in the original sense of stealing the wells, and don't be a Philistine in filling up someone else's wells either, because both of them are destructive acts, and we should learn how to preserve the wells of Avraham and the wells of Yitzchak, and to dig our own wells, to really redig the wells of our fathers, and to then dig our own wells, just like Yitzchak does in a couple of weeks hence. All right, so that's what I wanted to share with you today, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. Karen, nothing to add here? No? Okay, sorry. Okay, so have a good week, everybody. We'll see you, Mitzvah Shem, next time. Take care.
Thank you.